The U.S. election is in just 15 days, and a record number of people have already cast their ballots in early voting. But in some areas, the large early turnout and technical glitches have led to long waiting lines, and that has sparked a controversy in states like Georgia over whether officials are actively trying to make it harder for some people to vote. DW's Sumi Somaskanda has more.
Voting. It's the foundation of any democracy. Everything is being done to make sure all eligible voters have their say. Or is it? I came here to Georgia to find out about something that voting rights groups say is a real problem: voter suppression, purposely making it harder for some people to cast their ballot. Now, Georgia has a history of keeping African Americans from the polls. Activists say it is still happening. Things heated up in 2013 when the Supreme Court gave states the power to change election laws, and they no longer had to prove the changes they made did not discriminate. States like these took action that Republicans say make sure that no one can vote illegally. Democrats, though, say they unfairly target minorities. They introduced stricter voter identification laws, they purged inactive voters from registries, and across the South, hundreds of polling places closed. These people managed to get to the voting station, but for others who don't have a car to get around and the millions who don't have official ID, it is difficult. The protections can be barriers, and they more often affect Black and immigrant communities.
We are in the land of voter suppression, where the Secretary of State's office, backed by the legislature, embraced by the governor, are figuring out how do we stop the demographic change that is happening in Georgia.
Early voting in this year's presidential election, and people stand in line for hours. But is this really voter suppression?
This idea that there's voter suppression going on today is just a myth. There are long lines because people are making the mistake of voting early rather than voting on election day when there are many, many more polling places open.
Marnia Mitchell will be voting early. The stationery designer says it took her 4 hours to vote in the primary election in June. She fears longer lines on November 3rd, and she's not going to risk missing her chance to vote.
It's my right. The Constitution says I have a right to vote. People died for that, and I don't take that lightly. I can only imagine people seeing other folks being able to cast a vote. And for them, one, to be told they're not human, and two, to be told that whatever you think, whatever you want in your community, it doesn't matter. I reflect on that, and that's why I stood there.
She is not alone in her determination.
It's important that we show that we deserve equal rights just like everyone else.
That's why the United States of America is the country it is, democracy, everyone has a vote.
There's a lot of things that's going on in the country, and if we don't speak out, it's going to continue to get worse.
That sentiment has sparked a record number of Americans to turn out early to vote.
Well, it's not just voter suppression clouding this election. As Sumi Somaskanda just reported, looming large is also the corona pandemic. And that's because many of the volunteer workers who usually help to make sure that elections run smoothly are the ones that are most vulnerable to this virus. And many of them have decided now to sit this election out. Let's get you more on that. Peter Rolledal from our U.S. elections team is here with me. All right, what have you learned?
Well, this was always expected to be one of the most contentious elections in at least a generation. But the pandemic has really thrown that extra wrench into the engine of U.S. democracy, the likes of which we have rarely seen. That's because these elections rely very heavily on volunteers. Experts estimate that as many as 1 million volunteers are needed for everything from manning the polling sites to helping voters fill out the ballots correctly to register new voters. But here's the catch. Typically, nearly 60% of these volunteers are aged 60 or older. And that means, obviously, that this is also the same age group that health experts say is the most vulnerable to the virus. Now, I talked to Dan Cordham. He's a retiree from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, one of the battleground states. And he is one of the many older volunteers who is going to sit this one out. Let's hear what he said.
I am clearly in the category of people who are potentially at risk. I have no significant underlying conditions that I'm aware of, but I am 71 years old, and you're signing documents, you're trading pens back and forth, you're handing things off with the voters. There is interaction. And so based on all of that, I decided that it probably was best that at least this time I should sit it out.
What does it mean if volunteers like Dan, like he said, are going to sit this one out?
Well, this can have quite dramatic consequences. Take Milwaukee, for instance, in another key battleground state, Wisconsin. When it had its primary election back in April, the city had such a dire shortage of volunteers that it had to close 175 of its 180 polling stations. And that means that many voters had to wait in lines for hours, but even worse, that turnout actually dropped quite dramatically compared to 2016.
Oh, gosh. So what's being done now to cope with these shortages?
Well, thanks to concerted recruiting efforts by, initiatives like Power the Polls, but also LeBron James, who's teamed up with the Obamas with his More Than a Vote initiative. They are helping recruiting young people to really fill in the gap left behind by people like Dan. And one of the volunteers is Catherine, who is Dan Corden's own daughter. Now, she lives in Washington, D.C., and joined me on this Skype call with her dad. And I asked her about her decision to volunteer. Let's listen in.
So I like my dad quite a bit. Dad is the one who would normally be at the polls. I can't take my own dad's place because I don't live where he does, but I could replace somebody else's dad here in the District of Columbia. I'm a relatively low-risk person, so much better to have me get it than somebody else's high-risk parents from volunteering at the polls. I may not know the person here in the district that I'm taking the place of, but they're somebody's parents, and they matter to somebody. So if I can keep that person from being at risk, I'll do everything that I can.
Right. So young people like Catherine, even some as young as 16, actually, in some states who can't even vote yet, really stepping up there to, help ensure a safer and smoother election for all Americans. Now, many states say that they've now met their recruiting targets, but there are still some key grounds, including Pennsylvania, where Catherine's dad, Dan, lives, that are still reporting severe shortages. More than that, though, the reality is, and I think that's what we saw in that report, is that, the challenges facing America this election far exceed the pandemic. To ensure free, fair, and smooth elections, it will require more than simply recruiting a new generation of voters. It will likely require fundamental voting reform.
All right. Well, what a great sentiment that Catherine there conveyed to you, Peter Oledal. Thank you for that very interesting angle. Thank you.
Thank you.